This is GPS, the Global Public Square. Welcome to all of you in the United States and around the world. I'm Fareed Zakaria. We'll begin today's show with talk of thermonuclear war. That is what the North says the Korean Peninsula may be on the brink of. And they say the person responsible is President Trump. What should he do now? Is it even possible to tamp down the tempers there? That and much more with a terrific panel. Then President Trump and coal.
Get ready because you're going to be working your asses off, all right?
Trump thinks coal is coming back, but it isn't, and I will explain why. Also, two critical votes in two crucial nations. First, the Turks are going to the polls on Sunday to decide whether they want their president to be almost all-powerful. Will Recep Tayyip Erdogan get what he wants and potentially be in office until 2029? And next weekend, France votes on a new president, and the French envoy to America breaks tradition and risks his job by blasting the woman who could win that election. Ambassador Gerard Araud explains to me why he's speaking out. Finally, why London's Tower Bridge has created a big debate in China. I'll explain. But first, here's my take. I didn't really believe there was such a thing as Trump Derangement Syndrome. Hatred of Donald Trump so intense that it impairs people's judgment. It's not that I didn't notice the harsh, unyielding language against Trump. I've said a few tough things myself. But throughout the campaign, Trump seemed to do things that justified it. Once elected, instead of calming down and acting presidential, he continued the stream of petty attacks, exaggerations, and lies. His administration seemed marked by chaos and incompetence. And then came the strike against Syria. On that issue, Trump appears to have listened carefully to his senior national security professionals, reversed his earlier positions, chosen a calibrated response, and acted swiftly. I supported the strike and pointed out, in print and on air, that Trump was finally being presidential because the action, quote, seemed to reflect a belated recognition from Trump that he cannot simply put America first, that the President of the United States must act on behalf of broader interests and ideals, unquote. On the whole, though, I was critical of Trump's larger Syria policy, describing it as incoherent. From the response on the left, you would have thought I had just endorsed Donald Trump for Pope. Otherwise thoughtful columnists describe my views as nonsense. One journalist declared on television, if that guy could have sex with this cruise missile attack, I think he would do it. A gaggle of former Obama speechwriters discussed how my comments were perhaps the stupidest of any given on the subject. White House speechwriters must have written the lines that President Barack Obama spoke on September 27, 2013, announcing the UN deal in which the Syrian regime agreed to give up its chemical weapons stockpile.
This binding resolution will ensure that the Assad regime must keep its commitments or face consequences. We'll have to be vigilant about following through.
In other words, the Trump administration watched a violation of Obama's 2013 deal and enforced it in precisely the manner that Obama had implied, which is why virtually every major Obama foreign policy official, from Hillary Clinton to Thomas Donilon to Leon Panetta to David Petraeus, has supported the Trump administration's action, as did U.S. allies in the region and beyond. The strikes were discreet, measured, intended to convey a signal, and yet at the same time designed to ensure that the U.S. did not descend further into the Syrian civil war. In other words, they were very Obama-like. Two senior Obama officials I spoke with told me that were Barack Obama still president, he would have likely ordered a strike that was similar, if not identical, in scope. Presumably, those former speechwriters would then have used different words to describe the same strikes. Conservatives seem to understand Trump's about-face better than liberals. Many of Trump's strongest backers are utterly distraught by his embrace of Obama's policies. Andrew McCarthy wrote in National Review, when it came to foreign policy, I was worried that the 2016 election would be a case of Clinton delivering the third Obama term. Instead, we have Trump giving us the third Clinton term. Liberals have to be careful to avoid Trump derangement syndrome. If Trump pursues a policy, it cannot axiomatically be wrong, evil, and dangerous. In my case, I've been pretty tough on Donald Trump. I attacked almost every policy he proposed during his campaign. The week before the election, I called him a cancer on American democracy and urged voters to reject him. But they didn't. He is now president. I believe that my job is to evaluate his policies impartially and explain why, in my view, they are wise or not. Many of Trump's campaign promises and policies are idiotic and unworkable. It was always likely he would reverse them, as he has begun to do this week on several fronts. Those of us who opposed him face an important challenge. We have to ask ourselves, would we rather see Trump reversing himself or Trump relentlessly pursuing his campaign agenda? The first option would be good for the country and the world, though it might save Trump from an ignominious fall. The second would be a disaster for all. It raises the quandary: do we want what's better for America or what's worse for Donald Trump? For more, go to cnn.com/Fareed and read my Washington Post column this week. Let's get started. Let's get straight to North Korea's warning that, quote, thermonuclear war may break out any moment on the peninsula, unquote. David Frum was a speechwriter for President George W. Bush. He is now a senior editor at The Atlantic. Tony Blinken was Deputy Secretary of State and Deputy National Security Advisor in the Obama administration. He is now a CNN Global Affairs analyst. And Corey Shockey worked with George W. Bush's National Security Council, edited a book with Defense Secretary Mattis, and is now a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. So, David, what do you make of the fact that after having promised to call China a currency manipulator at day one, he says now it's not a currency manipulator after all? He says, I said NATO was obsolete. It's not obsolete. We're not going to get involved in Syria. We are getting involved in Syria.
Donald Trump may have represented himself to some of his supporters as an anti-interventionist, but the consistent theme is he's actually anti-alliance. The United States is now steering for one after another confrontation and steering alone. If you knew you were heading for a confrontation in the Korean Peninsula, you would not begin by canceling the Trans-Pacific Partnership, burning every potential friend you have in the region. In Syria, you do not start this confrontation without your European partners. The United States is alone, 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 and that is the consistent theme of the Trump foreign policy.
Interesting. Corey, what do you think?
Well, for Korea, the real constraint on the problem is you can't take a policy harder line than the South Korean government's willing to take. It parallels the Berlin crisis during the Cold War. You just can't go further than our allies, and I don't think the Trump administration has yet acknowledged that to the extent that they should, although Vice President Pence's trip to the region may help that.
But it was encouraging that on China, he reversed himself. On NATO, he reversed himself.
Fareed, I think that instead of building a wall, the president's running into a wall, and it's called reality. We've seen reversals, as you noted, on a number of major issues. I happen to think that he's now doing more the right thing than the wrong thing. David's right. There's been this disdain for alliances, working with partners. But even on that, he's coming around. He said the right thing about NATO this week. He's now trying to figure out a way to work with the Chinese on North Korea instead of work over them or around them. And that's at least positive, so we should commend it where we can. But on North Korea in particular, this is the #1 dilemma, because North Korea is racing to the point where it has an intercontinental ballistic missile that it can marry to a nuclear warhead and actually hit the United States in the hands of a leader who at best acts impulsively and maybe even irrationally. So this is the most urgent priority for the president, and getting this right really
Tell
matters.
me, when you were handling this issue, is it not fair to say that when you talk to the Chinese about it, they have a reasonable perspective? They say, look, this is right next door to us. If we press the North Koreans, it's a bankrupt regime. The regime could collapse. We would have millions of refugees. We would have a Korean unification on South Korean terms. And then we, the Chinese, face on our border a unified Korea on South Korean terms with 30,000 American troops, a treaty alliance with America, and 8 nuclear bombs. Why would we do that?
You've just laid out China's case, and it's probably the same case that President Xi apparently laid out for President Trump when they met. But here's the thing. China mostly fears instability on the peninsula for the reasons you cited. North Korea is now the single greatest source of instability. They need to do something about it. What we've made clear to China, we started doing this during the Obama administration, I hope that President Trump has continued, is that North Korea is now a core interest of the United States. Just as China talks about Taiwan being a core interest, North Korea and the growing danger it represents is a core interest from us. That means two things. It means ideally we work with China to try to change the situation, to put enough pressure on North Korea to get it to the table, to negotiate. But failing that, or as we're trying to do that, we have to take steps to protect ourselves and our allies. More missile defense, a greater military presence in the region. We sent to Vincent just a few days ago. And probably more sanctions, including perhaps on Chinese who are doing business with North Korea. None of this is directed at China, but China's not going to like it. And that could be incentive for China to really get strong on North Korea.
Corey, what do we do about South Korea? Because you rightly point out, they are terrified both of the prospect of war on the Korean Peninsula. I think Seoul is 30 miles or 35 miles from the North Korean border. Most of South Korea's population lives within a very close striking range of North Korean missiles. And they worry about a kind of collapsed North Korea. I've talked to South Koreans often, and they point out that North Korea is many times larger than East Germany and many times poorer.
I think that's right. The South Koreans are anxious about their vulnerability, the vulnerability of their population centers to hardened artillery sites launching across the DMZ. So, and they're right to be concerned about that. I do think, though, that the Chinese case for their North Korea policy shouldn't be accepted, right? That there are a lot of variables in that are being treated as fixed. For example, if the North Korean regime were to collapse, the United States could reassure the Chinese that, first of all, we wouldn't send American troops north of the current DMZ. And second of all, if South Korea isn't threatened by North Korea, you could actually remove American troops from the Korean Peninsula. There are lots of things that we could make variables in this that the Chinese are treating as fixed.
And of course, also denuclearize. You could get rid of the nuke.
Absolutely, because we unilaterally denuclearized South Korea. The North Koreans just ramped up their threat as a result of that.
You say be patient.
Be patient. I don't understand why the United States is talking so much or talking so loud. As dangerous as North Korea is, in the end, look, they need money. This is not a strategic calculation. This is a blackmail operation. It's like a hostage taking. And as the cops always say in the hostage taking situation, they go home to a hot dinner. They go home to a warm bed. They've got time. And you do not, if you are the police, you do not shoot first. You don't commit suicide for fear of death. This is one to wait out.
All right. We will be back in a moment, and we're going to talk about the dropping of the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan. Was it a Trumpian stunt or something more serious? And we are back with David Frum, Kori Schake, and Tony Blinken. Tony, from what you can tell, was this mother of all bombs intended as a signal outside of Afghanistan?
Well, if it was, it's probably the wrong signal, because the bomb that they used, and I defer to the military experts and I trust their judgment, is designed to take out things at the surface or maybe very, very, very shallow tunnels. If you're going after, at the end of the day, North Korea or even in Iran with deeply buried programs, that's not the munition you would use. There's something called the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP, that is designed to do that. This is a different weapon, and if that's the message they were trying to send, it's probably not the right message to send with this weapon.
This sounds like the Ali G skit where Trump uses the wrong acronym and the Pentagon uses the wrong bomb as a result. What about the fact that it might have reminded a lot of Americans, 16 years later, we're still in Afghanistan. We're still, fighting these. Every time we withdraw from an area, the Taliban returns. What do we do?
Well, Donald Trump has promised that he would fight wars and win them. The United States has had a long run of inconclusive wars, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why he won the Republican nomination. There was a buried trauma in the Republican Party about Iraq. Nobody would talk about it. We were going to nominate Jeb Bush, this brother of the man who opened this trauma that the party has never discussed. Donald Trump talked about it, and he had an answer. It may not have been a truthful biographical answer, but it was psychologically true. But now he's embarked again on one of these open-ended conflicts. There's no plan that one can see, and it is interesting to think, how does he even psychologically cope with the commitments that he's undertaking on behalf of us all?
We had the missile strike in response to Assad's use of chemical weapons. I applauded that. It was the right thing to do. but it's a missile strike in search of a strategy. How do you use that? How do you leverage that, hopefully, for example, to get the Russians to do more to try to bring the civil war to an end? Those are the kinds of strategies, those are the kinds of deliberations that they need to be having in advance of taking action so that there's actually a game plan to follow through. That's what we need to be looking for.
I think you should be careful of applauding something, even if it aligns with your values and instincts. I think it's a good rule of thumb. If it were good foreign policy, Donald Trump would not be doing it. That even if you like the strike, you can't, that the fact that there's no process, that there was no deliberation, that there's no interagency process because there are no agencies, there are no deputies meetings because there are no deputies. It seems to have been done fitfully and impulsively and with no answer to the question, okay, so what do you do the next day? I think when you talk about normalizing, the reason normalization is not just a moral objection. The reason normalization is dangerous is it leads you to make bad assessments of what is actually happening. And this administration remains as random and fitful as ever. And it's just not true.
Could he do anything that would change your mind?
He's him. He's never going to stop being him. He's never going to become some other person. And you cannot build the United States government in such a way that the people around the president control the president, unless he's a Wilsonian-type invalid, and not even then. He will be the center and turning point. It's not, the way it does not work is that if the president and the Secretary of Defense have a disagreement, the president must resign. That's not what happens.
What do you think of this? I mean, there is this, what I've described as there are two parts to the Trump administration. There's the freak show that is Donald Trump. But then there are people like Jim Mattis, McMaster, Tillerson, and the Economic Front, Gary Cohn. These are serious people. They're heavyweights. They believe in process. They believe in thoughtful reflection. And on the record, they have said mostly very sensible things. What's going to happen? Will the freak show win or will the grown-ups win?
You know, I actually think I agree with David, the fundamental challenge is that the president is undisciplined and he's erratic in his choices. I think the deliberative men of the Trump administration can put good processes in place. And I disagree with David. I think the strike on Syria, they did think their way through what are alternatives, where do those courses take us. But you cannot, in the American political system, you cannot protect against the president's influence.
Three things, I think, Fareed. You need three things: people, process, policy. These are three things that the president has shown a disdain for. If he can get them right, if he can get the right people in, David's right, they haven't filled the ranks of government. If they can actually have a process that they carry forward through the National Security Council, and if they can develop policies, some of which may not survive first contact, but it gives you a place to start, then I think this can be at a better place. Then the Achilles heel is this: it's credibility. Right now, in the wake of this strike, we're in an information war with Russia and with Syria over the strike. And Syria and Russia are trying to claim any responsibility for it. False narratives. Unfortunately, as the president keeps tweeting every day and tweets that are fact-averse, that undermines his credibility at a time when we desperately need it. This is a president's most valuable currency, his credibility. And unfortunately, President Trump, if he continues on that course, is going to default on it.
He can hire the best people in the world, but if any one of them appears on the cover of Time magazine, that person's career inside this administration is over.
As the one person who has is Steve Bannon, and it appears to be exactly as you say. All right. Thank you. Fascinating conversation. Next on GPS. King coal once powered America. Donald Trump says he's bringing coal back, but he won't be able to do that. The odds are against him, and I'll explain why.
Want a daily dose of Fareed and his team? Now you can get it with Fareed's Global Briefing, the newsletter that gives you the best insight and analysis on global affairs. Go to cnn.com/Fareed.
And now for our What in the World segment. Welcome to Benham, Kentucky. Population here, deep in the heart of coal country, hovers around 500. The town has a coal miners' park, a coal miners' theater, and the Kentucky Coal Mining Museum. Soon there will be solar panels on the roof of the museum to power it, in this town where King Coal has ruled for more than 100 years. It is a sign of the times. Let's look at some numbers. For decades, King Coal was the primary energy source for power generation in the United States. But since 2000, coal has been on a steady decline, so much so that in 2016, cheap and abundant natural gas surpassed coal as the dominant source for energy generation in the U.S. Renewables like wind, solar, geothermal, and hydroelectric have also been on the rise, and supply about 10% of U.S. energy needs, which means coal mining jobs have become an endangered species. At its peak in 1923, the coal industry employed almost 705,000 miners. But thanks to the effects of efficiency and automation, those numbers have been on a sharp decline since then. By 1980, the total had dropped to 225,000. And in 2015, the number of coal miners employed in the United States was down to just 66,000. Contrast that with the solar industry, which employed 260,000 people in 2016, a 25% increase over the 2015 numbers. What is behind the fall of coal and the rise of the rest in the U.S.? It's simple economics. Coal is more expensive than many of the alternatives. And the big natural gas boom in the U.S. and the rise of renewables have both put the squeeze on the demand for coal. And then there is the pollution problem. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, coal plants are the nation's top source of carbon dioxide emissions, the primary cause of global warming. About 23% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. come from power plants that use coal. But President Trump thinks he's going to reverse coal's increasing obsolescence. At the end of March, President Trump traveled to the EPA to sign what was called an executive order to create energy independence. In a single stroke, he rolled back Obama-era regulations which would have significantly reduced pollution emissions from coal-fired power plants. Trump's claim that eliminating those regulations would bring jobs back to the coal mining industry. I guess he's trying to make good on a campaign stop last May where he told coal miners,
Get ready because you're going to be working your asses off, all right?
but there's widespread agreement that coal is not going to suddenly come roaring back, nor will the jobs. Across the U.S., coal-fired plants are closing in record numbers. And until the economics change, the number of power plants using coal will keep falling. So why is Trump so stuck on coal? Well, according to a report from NPR, the answer may lie in the states where all those solar jobs are being created. The top 6 states generating the most solar industry employment all voted for Hillary Clinton. States with the fewest amount of new solar jobs all went for Trump, including 3 key states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which flipped from Democrat to Republican in 2016. In any event, the revival of coal is one more false promise and fake prediction from Trump that just isn't going to happen. Next on GPS, one nation's president has asked his people to allow him to potentially be in office until 2029. Turkey's people are voting on it this weekend, and we will dig into what is going on when we come back. Turks are going to the polls on Sunday for what one scholar called in the Washington Post the most consequential referendum in modern Turkish history. And that is not hyperbole. The referendum would change Turkey's governance from its current parliamentary system to a presidential one. It would massively empower the current strongman of Turkey, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Since the attempted coup that captivated the world's attention last July, Erdogan has consolidated power. This would be the culmination of that process. If passed, the referendum would abolish the prime minister, defang parliament, give the president power to appoint ministers and Supreme Court judges, as well as the authority to dissolve parliament or declare a state of emergency. And Erdogan would even have the opportunity to extend his term in office until 2029. One of the finest chroniclers of Turkish politics joins me now to discuss. Mustafa Akyol is a fellow at the Freedom Project at Wellesley College. He writes for the New York Times. He has a new book called The Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims. Mustafa, pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure to be on the show.
It does seem as though this referendum basically undermines the liberal part of liberal democracy. It gets rid of the constitutional checks and balances on the executive, and it gives Erdogan in particular this vast authority. How dangerous is it?
It is dangerous, Fareed, certainly. Turkey has fallen into a problem that you rightly identified many years ago, illiberal democracy. Ballots rule in Turkey. Whomever wins the ballots gets the power, and that is President Erdogan right now. But other aspects of liberal democracy, such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of dissent, separation of powers, these are being undermined. And if this constitutional major amendment passes in the referendum, it will be further undermined, in my view. So
a lot of people have said if it fails, it will also plunge the country into crisis because Erdogan will not react kindly to the failure of this. This has been his pet project for years now.
That is true. Whatever comes out, Turkey will not be a liberal democracy anytime soon, in my view, because all this is happening at the context of a very intense political war in Turkey. Supporters of President Erdogan think that he's the man to save Turkey after a century of being in the wilderness. He's making Turkey great again. There are big enemies against him. That's why we should rally behind him. The other half of the country thinks President Erdogan is becoming an autocrat and he's threatening them. And that very poisonous polarization is here with us to stay. And whatever comes out in the referendum, it will not solve that problem.
You're teaching in Wellesley. I presume it would be difficult for you to be as outspoken in Turkey today.
It has to be, you have to be careful about what you're saying, because I think one aspect of the current ruling psychology, current ruling regime is paranoia. So everything you say against the government, critical of the government, can be taken as a sign of a conspiracy. You're a part of a plot. You're a pawn of nefarious powers. In that sense, conspiracy theory is a lot to, I think, this authoritarian drive in Turkey. And yes, everybody who's in Turkey who's critical about Turkey, I think, has to watch its language. And that's a fact of life we all have to now see and accept.
Fascinating case of the kind of descent of democracy. All right. To me, the most interesting thing about this book is that what you are trying to remind people is that Islam, unusually surprisingly, in a sense, has a very special place in its canon for Jesus. Okay?
Indeed, Ferry. Today, some people think there are great clashes between Islam and Christianity, the great religions of our world today. But in this book, I wanted to look at the theological bases. And there are interesting bridges. I mean, Jesus is a figure so highly revered in Islam. When you look at Mary, she is the most praised woman in the whole Muslim scripture. Jesus is venerated as the prophet of God, but also Messiah, the Word of God, very powerful terms if you know Christian theology. So in my book, I wanted to highlight this Muslim image of Jesus and also show how it actually corresponds to some early sects in Christianity, which found themselves in history as heresies, but actually said things that are very similar to Islam. And that connection between different Christian sects and Muslims is something that actually puzzled scholars and theologians for centuries.
The historian Bernard Lewis used to say people need to ask, why were there Jews and Christians in the Middle East, in the Muslim Middle East to begin with? Obviously, it had been at some point a hospitable place for them to be.
Exactly. And one thing I also highlight in the book, Farid, is a message at the end, what Jesus can teach Muslims today. I think the way theology about Jesus is one thing, but the teachings of Jesus to his fellow Jews in first century is a message that is valid for every religion. And he reminded the Pharisees, for example, of his time, the more pious, observant Jews, that one should not be just drawn into the literalism with blind obedience to law, but should try to see the moral purposes behind that. And I think that's a message that Muslims need today. So therefore, in the book, on the one hand, I highlighted differences and similarities theologically, but I also said the teachings of Jesus is something that Muslims should look at today to find a way for change and transformation and reform in Islam.
Mustafa Akil, on Turkey, on Islam, always intelligent. Pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much, Farid. It's a pleasure.
Next on GPS, France's ambassador to the United States has rather undiplomatically criticized one of the two leading candidates for his country's presidency, saying a win by Marine Le Pen would be a total disaster. That ambassador, Gerard Araud, will join me to explain when we come back.
Thursday at 10 on CNN.
Next Sunday, the people of France will go to the polls to elect a new president. It's a crucial test in the wake of Brexit, and the race has been sometimes brutal and always hotly contested. If you turned on the TV last week in France, you might have thought you were watching a rerun of an American primary campaign debate. The spectacle lasted 4 hours, featured 9 men and 2 women. Yes, that is 11 candidates for France's presidency. One of the 2 women was Marine Le Pen. She is the daughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, the longtime leader of the right-wing populist, anti-immigrant, and even racist National Front Party. Madame Le Pen took over the party 6 years ago and has carried on many of her father's policies. She dropped some of the racism, but she added a starkly anti-EU element, describing the union as an anti-democratic oligarchy. Le Pen has recently polled essentially tied for first place with centrist candidate Emmanuel Macron. France's sitting ambassador to the US, Gerard Araud, recently said it would be a total disaster if Le Pen won. I asked him into the studio to explain why he broke diplomatic tradition to say such a pointed thing. Ambassador Araud, pleasure to have you on.
Nice to meet you.
You have been remarkably outspoken on the dangers of Marine Le Pen becoming president. Let me ask you very simply, you're a French diplomat. What would happen if she were to become president?
Actually, there is a real debate, I guess, among the French diplomats. My colleague, the ambassador in Tokyo, really made, in the press, said, I won't serve Marine Le Pen if she's elected. And because for us, you know, the diplomats, all our career has been dedicated to explain France to the foreigners, but also especially we have a deep commitment to the European Union. You know, European policy is not a policy among other policies. It's a choice of civilization. It's a choice for democracy, liberal democracy. My country has been invaded 3 times in 70 years, 2 world wars, a genocide. So the lesson has been we want to build a united Europe. If Madame Le Pen is elected, she will take France out of the European Union, out of the euro. So it's not any policy. It's very particular. It's a change of our society. So I do believe that we, the diplomats, we have the right to say what we think.
What do you think explains the rise of Le Pen and this kind of right-wing populism that you're seeing throughout Europe?
I think it's not only throughout Europe, it's also throughout the US. I think it's for the first time in my life, I see that the political life in this country and in Europe, the political lives are so comparable. We have the same anti-establishment mood. Basically, some of our citizens are telling the elites, you didn't deliver for us, so I want to toss the table. So it's exactly the same rebellion. And which means that we have also to answer, you know, to their concerns. What does it mean, free trade? You know, really, is it possible to have a free trade which is citizen-friendly? What means a lot of questions, globalization, you know, cultural, economic globalization.
But a lot of it, don't you think, is immigration?
And there is the question of immigration. Immigration is part also, in a sense, of globalization. You know, really, it means that the goods, but also the people are traveling.
France has had a particularly complicated relationship with this. It has taken in lots of people from Algeria, from Morocco, but it has found it hard to assimilate them. Is that going better, worse? How would you describe, you know, France's struggles with assimilation?
The fact is that we have, in terms of numbers, we have the first Muslim community in Europe, you know, really basically between 8 and 9% of the population, which means that we have some neighborhoods which are fundamentally Muslims, and in these neighborhoods you have some fringe people or organizations which are testing us. You know, for instance, they come to us and say, we want to have a women-only day in the swimming pools. Or we don't want male doctors taking care of female patients. Or I don't want my daughter to go to the gym. So we have all these questions, and we have to face them, we have to answer to them.
But you tend to be pretty tough on these issues. You believe that France should defend its concept of secularism and liberalism and not give in to these demands.
Yes. The fact is that in France, religion is considered as a private issue. You know, so you shouldn't bring religion into the public space. And that's what some Muslims are trying to do.
Do you think that when you look at Brexit, does it mark in your mind a kind of catastrophic failure of the European Union? Does it mark an unraveling? How do you see it?
First, it's sad. You know, it's really a failure. You know, to think about the European Union between our British friends, frankly, it's very sad. I think on the front page of the French newspaper, it was written, we already miss you, Brits. And of course, we miss the British. So it's a failure. And in a sense, it's a lose-lose situation.
You don't think that Britain leaving is the harbinger of other countries possibly leaving Europe?
You know, nowadays, I can't tell you. I can't answer. You know, if I were asked before November the 8th, you know, whether Madame Le Pen will be elected in France, I would have answered never. But after what happened in this country on November the 8th, you know, I'm obliged to say that actually she may be elected. She may win the elections in France. And she has said very clearly that she wants France out of the EU. And frankly, it's not bragging, but if France is out of the EU, it's the end of the EU and the end of the Eurozone. So a lot of things will depend on the result of the French elections.
Do you think this is rattling the doors of the French elite?
Of course. You know, really, the people are telling us, you didn't deliver for us. And they are really the elites, and I'm part of this elite, you know, they are voting against us. And that's something extremely important, you know, really. And let's say that Monsieur Macron is elected. He will have in the coming 5 years to respond to these concerns, to show that the French elite or the French political system is really responding to these concerns. If he fails, she will be